Hello and welcome to this webcast series where we're seeking to explore advances in environmental assessment. I'm your facilitator, founder and director of Fothergill Training and Consulting, and I'm a fellow of the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment and a chartered environmentalist. I'm the host and facilitator of this webcast series, and today what we're going to be doing is continuing our exploration of the Office for Environmental Protection's review of England's environmental assessment regime. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll see this webinar is a special, this webcast is a special series that's exploring that OEP report into environmental assessment. This episode is going to focus on data accessibility. However, if you haven't already, I'd really recommend you go back and watch episode 1. That sets out the purpose behind the review, the research, and an overview of the key recommendations of the OEP's report. So it'll give you some really good context before we do the dive into data accessibility that we're going to look at in this episode. I should note we are recording this in early January 2024, so it's before the government has formally responded to the OEP's review report, and all recordings from the series can be found on Fothergill TC's YouTube channel and on our website, and the link to the report itself will be available on the page when we're having the Q&A at the end of the session. So without further ado, this session is going to be on data accessibility, as it says on the slide, and it's going to be delivered by Emma Hawthorne, Principal Scrutinising Environmental Law and Advice Manager at the OEP. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you, Josh, and hello, everybody. So I'm going to be talking through in a bit more detail on data accessibility. So in this episode, I'm going to talk about the data that's used for environmental assessments, and I'll go through our findings and recommendations to government and answer some questions that have been submitted to Josh. So episode 1, which was presented by Elaine, that was an introduction to our report, as Josh has just outlined, the work we undertook, the methodology, and a summary of our findings. So I'm just going to do a quick recap of that here. So it was a report under our function to monitor the implementation of environmental law under our power in Section 29 of the Environment Act, and we looked at EIA, SEA, and HRA. We undertook this work in the context of changes put forward by government to these assessment regimes. So we wanted to ensure that we understood the root causes of any issues with the existing system, as well as understanding what worked well so that we could understand government's proposals. So the work was approximately 1 year long. It included significant stakeholder engagement and work with 3 external contractors. Those reports are available on our website if you want to have a look at them in more detail. So our overall findings were that the issues that we found in our research were not with the legislation. So that's not to say that the legislation was perfect. We did find some areas for improvement. However, the key issues arise from the implementation of the regimes. And with that implementation, issues with implementation, we found 3 fundamental root causes. That's access to information, the extent of post-decision monitoring, evaluation and reporting, and access to expertise. And these are deep-seated issues which are not susceptible to easy fixes, but unless these issues are addressed, reforms to environmental assessment regimes are unlikely to deliver government's ambitions. So moving on to have a look in more detail at data accessibility. So we found 2 key issues. Firstly, that there's limited data sharing, and secondly, that there's no single set of agreed data standards. So why is this an issue? So those involved in environmental assessment need up-to-date, high-quality information on which to base their decision-making. So data is used by plan and project proponents to predict the impacts of their proposal and how to determine how alternative approaches might reduce those impacts. Statutory consultees and decision makers rely on that data to determine their level of concern in the proposal and to provide advice on the need for any further changes or planning conditions or requirements. So the availability and comparability of data is therefore key to environmental assessments. We found these issues with data accessibility exist because of the complex landscape of data and databases. So when undertaking environmental assessments, the first port of call is normally to look for existing data. And this can be stored in numerous locations and in multiple formats, so in national databases such as MAGIC or on local environmental record centres. And some of that data might be freely available and some data may have a charge. So we can see that if proponents wanted to submit their data post-decision to a database so that it's available for others to reuse, there could be confusion on how to submit the data. So for example, what format that data should be in and where it should be submitted. And this is supported by the evidence we found. Sharing data has a cost, so currently there's no incentive for proponents to share the data that they've paid to collect. And with this complex landscape of data and databases, this adds to the issue in terms of both financial and time costs to format and submit data. And then finally, various legal rights apply to data collected and analysed by proponents. And we found that this led to uncertainty and confusion amongst some local planning authorities and consultants about whether data could be shared with others for reuse. So the consequences of these issues are that stakeholders frequently raise concerns with us about the consequences of poor assessment on environmental outcomes. So if the data is inaccurate or incomplete, it will affect the quality of the assessment and the judgments and decisions made, and this can have negative impacts on the environment. A lack of data sharing and a lack of agreed standards results in duplication in data collection and repeated verification by statutory consultees and decision makers, and this can lead to delays. As Elaine will explain in episode 4, we know that there's limited skills and resources in public bodies, and this duplication of effort means that these limited resources are not used in the most effective way to protect the environment. And finally, limited availability of data at a strategic level, particularly biodiversity data, means that many significant environmental effects are not addressed until the project stage. So this lack of full assessment at the plan or programme level means that development is not steered away from the most environmentally sensitive areas. An application of the mitigation hierarchy, particularly the avoid impact stage, occurs too late in the process. In addition, cumulative and in combination effects are also more effectively and usefully considered at the strategic level. So moving on to have a look at our recommendations for data accessibility. The first recommendation, the purpose of this recommendation is to ensure that government understands why these data issues exist ahead of implementing any reforms through the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act. So we recommend that government engages with local planning authorities and other stakeholders to fully understand why these issues haven't been resolved previously and to identify and resource effective solutions. The second recommendation, the purpose is to ensure that data standards cover the entire data pathway. So the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act makes provision for data standards through the planning data regulations, but the scope of these is currently unknown. So our research has identified the need for data standards to cover plan, programme and project level data and the complete data pathway from data collection to reuse. And we also recommend data standards for post-decision data in Chapter 4 of our report, and this will ensure that data collected from monitoring is comparable and available for reuse. And the final recommendation under data accessibility, as we set out in our report, spatial planning is key to sound decision making and to deliver new environmental measures such as biodiversity net gain and local nature recovery strategies. A good spatial plan will set out how different measures work together and deliver both national and local objectives. So as I mentioned earlier, we're aware that there's numerous databases of environmental data, so we didn't want to recommend a new database, but rather a portal that would bring together that data into one place. This issue requires sustained long-term attention from government, and we recommended a continuous improvement approach whereby the use, feedback and artificial intelligence or other technological advances are used to inform the portal's ongoing development. So that's the end of my presentation. I shall now hand back to Josh for some questions that we've received.
Many thanks, Emma, for that presentation and that deeper dive into those issues around data. Certainly resonates with me in terms of my experience of environmental assessments. And yeah, I remember back in I think it was 2012 and the 2012 to 2014, the proposals when we were still in the European Union, and how can we use what was then the Inspire directive to free up this data for environmental assessment. Unfortunately, we didn't achieve that, but then many other European countries didn't achieve that. That doesn't mean we should give up hope on this. So great to see that coming forward. Obviously, we're not live today, but we have had the ability to engage with a wider audience through some LinkedIn discussions, through yourselves and colleagues in November and December of 2023, going out and doing some conferences. So we have been able to bring some questions together, and just to highlight, Elaine Webb, who is a principal lawyer at OEP, is also on the session as she's part of the wider episodes. And Emma obviously mentioned she did episode 1 and will also be doing episode 4 if you do get a chance to catch that. So to delve into these data accessibility questions, we've just had a couple of questions. The first one, I guess, is, you know, we've got these developers, they're private developers often. I mean, on occasion they're public, but most of the time it's a private body. What's to incentivize them to actually to share this data?
Yes, this is a good question, and it's probably one of the most difficult issues in our report for government to resolve. So it's not possible to make plan and project proponents share data that they've paid to collect and analyse. And as I touched on in my presentation, some of that is due, for example, to intellectual property rights. And so the purpose of recommendation 1 in our report is to advise government to work with local planning authorities and other stakeholders to understand why this long-standing issue hasn't been resolved previously. And it's really important for government to understand this and you know, what are the ways to incentivize data sharing before they bring forward the planning data regulations. Ideally, we want to move to a situation where data sharing is the norm. And in our report, we do question whether there's a better way to gather and analyse data. So at the moment, we have something more like a reactive approach where each plan and project proponent collects their own data for their own project, and that data is then only really used once. And whether we could have a new approach whereby data is collected so that it combines with other data and basically gives us a better understanding of the environment. And this would be a more coherent approach and would have obvious links with other measures such as biodiversity net gain and local nature recovery strategies.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I did some work on digital impact assessment and run a series with the International Association for Impact Assessment, looking at those areas. And we had a speaker from Western Australia last year, maybe a couple of years ago, who was talking about a project that Western Australia is doing across its large infrastructure developers to try and bring all that data together and, yeah, kind of have a centralized environmental baseline rather than
Yeah,
individual baselines.
yeah.
I guess there's some hope for optimism. I think launched as beta version back in December or maybe late November was the Offshore Winds Evidence and Knowledge Hub, which is not a data hub itself, but I think links to existing data sets to make things easier. So hopefully the government can see opportunity and evidence and experience out there. And I guess there is inevitably going to be a degree of collaboration in terms of how that might move forward with those developers. To move on to the other question I've had then, how far do you think kind of government's existing work on data go to address these recommendations? You mentioned some forthcoming regulations that they're working on.
Yes, that's right. So it was also interesting that the National Infrastructure Commission made a similar recommendation on data in their recent report. So they recommended to government that developers' data should be shared on a central data sharing platform. And then government has actually already responded to the NIC's report. That government response came out in November. And in that government response, we were pleased to see that government does recognise the issues that we identify in our report. And in the NIC's response to the NIC's report, government says that data accessibility was their priority, which is great news to hear. So In terms of how this will be done, we're not able to see the details of that at the moment. So yes, as I mentioned, there's the planning data regulations and also environmental outcome reports, which will be coming forward. So they're both being introduced to the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act. And so we'll be taking a keen interest in how these are progressed.
Thank you for that. And I guess that's a useful reminder for those who are watching who are much more from perhaps an environmental assessment background, that you do have to have this wider perspective, particularly with the amount of data and how data links together digitally now, to not just look at perhaps the EOR regime that regulations that will come forward, but also these wider components that will make the system work and help address these challenges that we're highlighting through this mini series of webcasts. Well, I think that's all the questions I have on data accessibility. So really all it leaves is for me to say thank you for listening. Thank you to Emma for presenting and to Elaine for her presentations in the wider series. I've been Josh Fothergill from Fothergill Training and Consulting, providing the overarching series on advancing environmental assessments. You can get the OEP's reports from the link that was on the previous slide, and you can get access from there to the 3 evidence reports that were mentioned in this presentation. And you can get the other 3 recordings or other 3 episodes from this webcast mini-series on Fothergill TC's YouTube channel. So thank you very much for listening today, and that is where we're going to end today's recording.